Hello, everyone, and welcome again to Blogging Theology. And today I'm delighted to welcome back and talk to Dr. Abdul Wahid. You are most welcome, sir. Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
For those who don't know, Abdul Wahid has been active in Muslim affairs in the UK for over 25 years now, discussing Islam, political issues, the caliphate, very important subject, Palestine, even more important, and more besides. He's been published on the websites of 5 Pillars, Islam 21C, Foreign Policy, Open Democracy, the Times Higher Educational Supplement, and Prospect magazine. He's known for putting up Piers Morgan's blood pressure, and he is a regular guest on Blogging Theology, though I have not noticed any change to my blood pressure as a result. But I'll take my test afterwards and see if I'm in the same category as Piers. Anyway,
no, not at all.
You can watch. Obviously, people can watch your incredible encounters with the aforementioned guy on YouTube. Very interesting. You did very well in those, I thought. But to more serious matters, this week, the House of Commons here in the UK voted to allow a bill that seeks to legalize assisted suicide for those nearing the end of their lives to continue its path towards becoming law in the UK. In other words, the law is going to change ultimately, very likely, to allow so-called assisted suicide or self-killing with help from others. Now, this is a hugely significant moment for the UK. It has been compared, I think, rightly to the legalization of abortion in 1967 and the decriminalization of homosexuality. Yet many of those who spoke in favor of it seem not to acknowledge the huge societal changes that such a law would bring about and the unintended consequences that would inevitably follow, preferring to focus on the benefits, supposedly, of individual choice over the way they die. So there's a philosophical issue at stake here about moral autonomy, my body, my choice, and so on. We can come to that. But can we just get back to the bill, first of all, if we may? What's this bill about, in essence, and what are the arguments for and against the so-called assisted, I call it assisted self-killing?
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillah, salatu wassalam ala rasulillah wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa man wala. Rabbi shrah li sadri wa yassir li amri wahlul uqdadan min lisani yafqahu qawli. The bill, Paul, is actually called the Terminally Ill Adults End of Life Bill. And I think its authors deliberately chose this name for a few reasons. One, to narrow its current application solely to people who are said to be terminally ill, i.e. people who have a diagnosis of an illness which cannot be cured, and the only treatment they can receive is to palliate their symptoms. And two, it's very clearly talking about end of life, so there is some effort in the bill to try to define what they mean by end of life. Mm-hmm. And for the purposes of this bill, they've said 6 months. But you and I have, and others have called it the assisted dying bill, or the assisted suicide bill, or the assisted killing bill. I think you just called it now. Yeah. And I think it is basically assisted suicide. It is changing the law, the culture, the ethics of the UK in a way that where suicide is to be worked towards, to be prevented at all costs. For the first time, the lawmakers in this country have voted that no, there should be exceptions to that. We, as a state, should facilitate people committing suicide who have these incurable illnesses. And the bill basically says that if somebody's in the last 6 months of life and they're an adult and they're of sane, sound mind, and they choose that they want to end their life, and they can get 2 doctors to agree and a High Court judge to sign it off. The 2 doctors, by the way, don't have to know them. They don't have to be their doctors. They could be any 2 doctors. The High Court judge won't meet them. The High Court judge will be just checking the due process has been done properly, and that the various checks and balances about the person's soundness of mind have been taken into account. And in the end, the person will be given a cocktail of pills, most likely, to take themselves, which have no therapeutic benefit. Solely the purpose of the pills is to kill them.
Is to kill
themselves. Kill themselves. Now, it's been quite drafted carefully to say that the person takes the pills themselves, because if somebody else were to give them the pills, then that would be them assisting the suicide. But part of the reason the law is being changed is because more and more people want to take this route. And if they get family members or friends to assist them, those family members and friends under the current law would be prosecuted for assisting their suicide. And that would be subject probably to a criminal conviction for those people when they're doing this out of an act of compassion, in their view. The argument is that there are some people for whom, even if they had the best palliative care, the best pain relief, the best treatments for their breathlessness and distress and agitation and nursing care, it still wouldn't be enough. It would still be something that would require them to suffer immensely before they die. And
so it's implication. Yes, sorry, I didn't try a second, because this I could be wrong, but it seems to be a lot of this argument is about suffering, and people don't want to suffer anymore, ending their lives. But what is the state of palliative care? What is palliative care? Perhaps you could explain that.
So I think,
is it ineffective? Is it completely ineffective when it comes to these end of life scenarios?
Yeah. So I think that question is so important to discuss as people, because for millennia, when people died, they died in different ways, didn't they? So some would be killed on a battlefield, some will be killed by accident in a falling off a horse. Some will have a disease which kills them instantly, like a heart attack. Some will have an infection that will kill them over a few days. And some will have things like cancers, which are slow and painful and take months and months and months, and in the modern age, probably years sometimes to kill them. So suffering at the end of life is hardly a new thing. And yet I'm struggling to think of any time in history where a civilized society has facilitated the suicide of people. And it's not like we're suddenly so advanced that we have means of suicide they didn't have in the past. I mean, they were taking hemlock in Greek and Roman times to kill people. They were poisoning people with hemlock, and it wasn't suffocating. Yes, Socrates. Yes,
you mentioned Socrates. He was executed by the Athenians for allegedly corrupting the youth, and he's a philosopher, obviously, and he was required to take hemlock, a poison, to kill himself, and he could have escaped, but he chose not to. And there's a long dialogue written by Plato, a very lively sense of the afterlife, life after death, and so on. He wasn't an atheist or anything like that. But yeah, I mean, that's the famous example of the ancient world as someone who took poison as an execution. Actually, he was executed, although he could have escaped. I mean, this is well known.
And this is one reason why this change in the attitude that we should facilitate suicide to end suffering is a fundamental change in the way this society runs. So Tim Stanley, a conservative commentator in the Daily Telegraph, his subtitle for his article on this was "We are not the same country as we were yesterday." After the bill,
yes, I read
and there's perhaps the shortest letter in one of the newspapers I read was by Mr. Kevin Duffy of Manchester, who just said, "Sir, a terrifying Rubicon has been crossed," and I think that is right. It's like it is. We have crossed into new territory, because whereas before human beings worked to preserve life and limit suffering, we're now trying to get into the very grey, very dodgy territory of trying to end life. Now, you asked about palliative care.
Yeah, so I was going to say, can I just disagree? I don't want to get in sidetrack. You're going to talk, palliative care really matters. I think that's the heart of it, in my view anyway. But you talk about a Rubicon being crossed. This is obviously Julius Caesar and crossing this line in Italy, and everything suddenly changed. I don't agree, actually. Now, obviously, what has happened with this proposed change in law is momentous, but I see it as simply another step on a path that we in the West have been walking along, a liberal secular path, for a very, very long time. And in an article that you published that was published on 5 Pillars, you yourself spoke about previous significant moments in UK history, the legalization of abortion in 1967, for example, which has now led in many ways to abortion on demand in the UK, where in certain circumstances unborn children can be killed very, very late indeed. And this without any regard apparently to their suffering in the womb when they're ripped apart in these disgusting so-called medical procedures. But behind that, is there not this philosophy in the West of secular liberalism, this emphasis on the individual, moral autonomy, my body, my choice, and the denial of the divine, the denial of God? I mean, in Islam, the Quran repeatedly says God is the owner of the heavens and the earth and everything in the universe. Ownership belongs to God, not to us. And so we have a responsibility as custodians of this planet and our lives. There's very different metaphysics going on there. And for me, that because we've gone through this cultural revolution since the Enlightenment in Europe, we are on that same path that has led to red line after red line after red line being crossed. This is simply the latest red line to be crossed. It's not a new thing in a philosophical sense at all, although this particular incident is very momentous. But it does continue a trend that's been going on arguably for many, many generations. So that would be my slight disagreement with you, perhaps.
Yeah, I take your point, and you're right to point out that example, and probably others, in it, that maybe we can say if this is crossing the Rubicon, then they crossed the Po and the Tiber already. So I don't know if that fits with the geography, by the way, of where these various rivers are. But the point being, this is a landmark moment, and I think I agree with you on that. And it is one of many landmark moments. Yeah. This is maybe a life and death moment, whereas some of those others were more about social changes in society, not very consequential, very, very dramatic. I suppose the Abortion Act was a life and death moment as well. It was a life and death moment. But the example I gave in that, you're absolutely right. But that example is very important in this, because one of the arguments against this is that this is what they call the thin end of the wedge. This is the first change, the most fundamental change, that will then be followed by other changes. So 6 months will become 12 months. Terminal illness will become non-terminal illness, which people just feel unhappy living with.
Like in Holland, for example, this happens in Holland and other places.
Canada, apparently in Canada, they passed an assisted dying bill a few years ago, which was just like this, which was very narrow, just about terminally ill people. But now it's expanded, people with mental illness, eating disorders, etc., etc. And this is and my example, using that example of the Abortion Act, was to show that things it doesn't matter how narrowly you word the law, you're changing the ethics and morals of society in a way that will facilitate this action for other people. And in fact, people have argued that under human rights law, how could you deny someone suffering who has 7 months to live assisted suicide when you're offering it to someone who has 6 months to live? How can you deny it to somebody with Parkinson's when you're allowing it for somebody with cancer? So this is the fear. And the Abortion Act in this country it's still to this day is effectively is worded saying you can only have an abortion under 24 weeks of pregnancy if you can get 2 doctors to testify that there is serious harm, physical harm to you as a mother, or mental harm to you as a mother, or et cetera, et cetera. So, but actually, although that process is followed when somebody does have an abortion, the forms are all signed by various doctors. There is really no process that looks at the impact of physical and mental harm. It is all about somebody's choice, and the state has decided that should be facilitated.
The harm to the baby, the harm done to the baby is never ever mentioned. No one cares about the baby. It's not even called a baby; it's called a fetus. Unless, of course, you're a mother who's pregnant, then you're with child, and everyone gets very happy about that. But then she wants to get rid of the child. It's no longer a child; it's called a fetus, which somehow changes its ontology in ways I've never quite understood. But I want to. I did interrupt you, and I apologize. But you were going to talk about this really important topic of palliative care. What is palliative care, and how is it relevant to this discussion?
So palliative care is, as I say, if you suffer with a disease which is incurable, which if left to its natural progression will most likely kill you. Palliative care is about doctors, nurses, and the health system gearing up to treat you in ways that reduce your suffering. So if you have pain, how do we relieve your pain? Is it through drugs? Is it through injections? Is it through blocking your nerves? Is it through sometimes giving cancer patients very targeted radiotherapy to help their pain? If you're breathless, what drugs and medicines and planning of your care will help your breathing problems? What care do you need at home? It doesn't deny people treatment for things like infections, which might cause them pain. So if you were terminally ill with an illness, but still had some kind of eye infection or skin infection that was causing you pain, you would still get antibiotics. But there isn't an effort to try and cure the disease because it's considered to be incurable by modern standards. But the philosophy in palliative care is this: I will treat my patient as best as I can and as much as I can. And if in the process of giving them pain relief, the amount of the medication I gave them in the end was so much that they actually stopped breathing because of the pain relief, then so be it. I'm not going to, the primacy of what I'm trying to do here is relieve my patient's symptoms. I'm not intending to kill them. I certainly am not intending to do that. I'm intending to relieve their suffering. But if in the process of doing that, somebody slipped away, passed away, died, then so be it. Palliative care works in a lot of cases. It doesn't work in all cases. There are some conditions which, it's very hard to relieve symptoms from.
What are we talking about?
I think the big one they always talk about is motor neurone disease, which is a disease where your muscles and nerves waste away, so you're effectively paralyzed in your entire body. Like it's what Stephen Hawking had, Dr. Stephen Hawking. And you start off as a fit and healthy person, and you'd have this degeneration of your muscles, and then you eventually die. But this disease was cited a lot in the debate going up to by people who believe in supporting assisting dying. Yet, Stephen Hawking's lived for many years with this disease.
Almost a normal lifespan, wasn't it, when he died?
Yes. So many people who live with motor neurons live for a very long time. So this particular bill wouldn't actually probably, if you strictly stuck to the rules and asked a doctor, is this person likely to die within the next 6 months? For many people, the honest answer to that would be probably not. But if somebody's choosing this route and if somebody's pushing for this, then I'm absolutely certain many sympathetic doctors would say, yeah, okay, we understand your suffering and we'll assist with this. Mm-hmm. So it's a very different change in psychology. And I can tell you this, have you heard of this term DNAR? Do not attempt resuscitation. Now, this acronym became famous during COVID times because in hospitals in the UK, people were being admitted in large numbers with COVID. And when they were elderly or frail or had multiple other illnesses, as is the normal case, doctors in the hospital make an assessment. If we tried to resuscitate this person with electric shocks and pressing on their chest if their heart stops, would it be likely to succeed? And if the answer to that is it probably wouldn't work, then they don't attempt it. That's the norm. It's a medical decision. It's usually taken with quite a bit of thought and care. But when this is understood by patients, relatives, loved ones, they often get very agitated. How could you make this decision about my family member? And that then colors their view of the medical profession, and they start not to trust the medical profession in their judgments because they think they want to deny care to patients. Now imagine now if this law is passed fully in the future, what that's going to do to the trust dynamic for a huge number of people. How are you going to know that I want to help you or I want to kill you when assisted suicide is one of the therapeutic options on the table?
It's not, absolutely, but it's not just these people who will perhaps not trust doctors, but what about doctors themselves? You're a medical doctor. You currently work in a practice in London. So how, and you obviously you're Muslim. So what do you do? A patient comes to you saying, my granny is sick and so on. I'd like you to help her die. I mean, or some of the circumstances. Well, how do Muslim and Catholic and committed Christians and other faiths, or even people of no faith, done? I'm not saying atheists are necessarily going to be supporting this either. I don't know. I imagine there's a range of views. But how are doctors going to be facing this? And what are doctors saying about this proposed legal change? Are they in favor of it? Are they against it?
There are some who will be in favor of it based on the same philosophical views that many other people hold in society, and which underpin the British state and British system and Western civilization, which is my body, my choice, as you said. So, and the ultimate autonomy for somebody is really choosing how and when and where they die.
Yeah.
And so there will be some doctors in favor of it on those principles. There will be some doctors who have a religious faith or who have a principle, even a secular principle, that this is a dangerous territory for doctors to be in. And there are many who are actually more concerned on the practical implications of this. Doctors have no training in this area. Palliative care is really one of the poor relations in the health service at the moment. It's very underfunded. Actually, only about a third of its funding comes from the state, and about 2/3 comes from charities. So what you're talking about is, a lot of doctors have said this, and some politicians said this, that you're talking about a two-tier system where the state will 100% fund, prioritize, and facilitate the assisted suicide if it's requested, but is underfunding and not facilitating good palliative care. And when you put, the choice to people like that, excuse me for using such a terrible and really unpleasant analogy, but it's like saying to someone who's facing an execution in revolutionary France, would you like me to use the sharp blade or the blunt blade? Because the palliative care is the blunt blade. It's not been looked after, and all the effort is going to be sharpening the guillotine for the people who want to choose the assisted suicide route. And so there's a lot of doctors who are arguing on a practical level how this can work.
So how would it work for you? I mean, I'm putting you on the spot.
I think most of these areas of medicine, there are going to be conscientious objectors to this sort of thing.
Do we know this? I mean, is the legislation?
No, we don't know this, and it is perfectly possible that the lawmakers decide that there should be no exceptions, that doctors should be offering this, should be facilitating this. If you're going to be a doctor in the NHS, it's perfectly possible they'll say you must participate in it.
Wow.
In which case, I think you'll find an awful lot of people finding that objectionable. Actually, I don't think I would be the only one, but I think you'll find an awful lot of people who'll find that objectionable. In fact, there's a very good, if you're our viewers are interested, there is a very interesting book called The Reality of Assisted Dying. Understanding the Issues, edited by Julian Hughes and Elora Finlay, and most of the contributors, I think, are doctors or nurses. And there are chapters covering the practicalities, the ethics, and right at the end they have 3 chapters on religious views. So you have a chapter on assisted dying in Islamic perspective, a Jewish perspective. I think there's a Christian perspective as well. Humanist case against assisted dying in euthanasia. So there are many practical issues, by the way. I mean, so this is this fantasy idea that means you take some kind of sleeping potion, like in a fairy tale, and you drift off into some cloudy reality. In Oregon, where they use the same system of a drug cocktail, I believe 9 people have woken up after taking this cocktail. Ooh. and you know, they could have side effects from the medication, they could have reactions from the medication, so nobody really knows how this is going to go. It has been presented in the most unbalanced way, with one side saying, oh, look at this horrible suffering, terrible disease, inadequate palliative care, and you know what we need is this Hollywood kind of death, where you know you take something after saying your goodbyes and everything's in your control. Nothing is ever like that in life and death matters. Nothing can make it like that.
I'm just interested that you presented a powerful case, which you call the slippery slope argument, the sense that in practice, even the tightest legal definition, which apparently it has been part of the legislation in the UK, tends to get loosened and watered down, and you know, expanded. You know, why 6 months? Why not 7? You know, why cancer? Why not other things which are less? And how are the supporters of this legislation responded to this? Because there's huge amounts of evidence. You mentioned Canada, for example, where in practice these things do become looser, more available, despite the initial intention that they should not. That seems to be how it works in practice in our societies. This is a really serious objection. And how are the supporters actually countered or even addressed this objection?
Well, they haven't. They either the proposer of the bill, Kim Leadbeater, I think that's how you say it, Kim Leadbeater, who is the proposer of this bill. I heard her interviewed and quizzed quite carefully on some of these issues, and she just kept coming back to the same points. We have the strongest safeguards built into this bill in the world. All right, so this just literally rhetoric coming back to these platitudes about how we've got the safeguards built in. I'm sorry that you can't say that. You can't know that. Another group of politicians who have backed it are those who say, look, I back it in theory. In practice, I doubt very much I'm going to back it at the last reading. But it's only fair because public opinion is in favor of it. It's only fair that we let it pass through the parliamentary process, and then it will get scrutinized more and more, both in the House of Lords and in the committee stages. So their argument is a lot of this uncertainty and problems will come out in due course.
You see,
people will vote against it.
Then they'll vote against it. So in fact, this process has not ended yet.
I'd say there's a problem with that in 2 ways. One is all that Parliament can do, all that the House of Lords and the committee stage can do now, all the House of Lords can do now is modify it. All the committee stage can do is scrutinise the arguments. But you're going to take it back to the House of Commons, where probably the same 270 people are going to vote against it. And we don't know how many will vote in favor of it and how many will swing to the other side. But my view is, as you say rightly, this is part of a wave of liberal changes in the UK that have been happening over decades. It's almost impossible to believe that this won't pass in future. Even if it doesn't pass this time, it's almost impossible.
Yeah, I think that's the momentum we're seeing in the West. This is not a UK thing. This is a transnational civilizational paradigm shift that we are seeing here. It really has to be seen, in my view, in that international global context, actually.
And I think one of the points I think that it's worth bringing out. I mean, I think there are two very important points for us as Muslims to think about beyond the detail of this bill. One is, like you say, this is a civilizational thing. So Western civilization comes to this from the viewpoint that I should be free to do what I like with my body, as long as it doesn't directly harm another person. And then everything else that's argued, protecting the vulnerable, stopping people from being exploited, stopping people from being coerced, all these things are added as an afterthought. They aren't. So society doesn't function to protect the weak. It functions to protect the individual and rights of the individual and promote the rights of the individual. And the weak come as an afterthought. And that's really very much a problem for us. I always think of the words of Abu Bakr as-Siddiq, may Allah be pleased with him, the first Khalifa of the Muslims, when he took his oath of allegiance from people and he made his speech, and he said, the strongest amongst you are furthermost in my mind. Sorry, the weakest amongst you are foremost in my mind until I restore your rights to you. And the strongest amongst you are furthest most from my mind until I restore the rights of the weak people. Amazing. So he's enunciating a principle there for his caliphate. And that's one of the examples for us to follow as Muslims, which is that the rights of the weak need to be foremost in the mind of the government, of the rulers.
But can I just, there's a beautiful saying there, I must say, absolutely important. But can I ask you now, perhaps as a Muslim, to address the philosophical or ethical issue here Islamically? So as you have correctly said, the keynote of our civilization is this great stress on so-called individual right, individual moral autonomy. We see it going right back to people like Kant in the Enlightenment, and many people are after him as well. And it's one of the defining characteristics of our Western civilization, that we own our own bodies, that we have autonomy and sovereignty, to the extent, as long as you say, we don't harm others. This is the kind of the formula. What is the Islamic position on ownership, on bodies, on this whole thing? And in terms of metaphysics, I mean, because I think really here we're dealing with a metaphysical difference at basis between the Western secular view and the Islamic / Christian, actually. Even there are traditional Christians today and traditional Jews as well, and others. There is a real fundamental metaphysical difference here. It's not just about individual issues and topics. It goes deep. Could you characterize that fundamental difference for us?
Yes. So we start with the Western principle of your sovereignty over your body is your own. We start with an Islamic principle, Lillahi ma fis samawati wa ma fil ard. Whatever is in the heavens and whatever is in the earth is for Allah, right? And that includes every single human being. So our lives, our bodies are the property of the Lord of the heavens and the earth, Allah. And so what we do with our lives and our bodies is determined by him. And where he says we can use them and we have autonomy over them and we can eat and we can drink and we can have relationships and we can work, we do that according to the laws of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And when it comes to things that he subhanahu wa ta'ala has decreed are solely in his domain, like the time limit on life, taking a life, not taking a life, it is not for us to violate those rules. Allah tells us in the Quran, in Surah Al-Ma'idah, in the meaning, in verse number 32 of the 5th chapter of the Quran, in the meaning, because of what we decreed upon the children of Israel, that whoever kills a soul, unless for a soul or for corruption done in the land, it is as if he's slain mankind entirely. And whoever saves one, it is as if he's saved mankind entirely. So really, Islam puts this huge, huge, huge emphasis on the value of human life. And really in this verse, it is limiting the situations in which there is justice in taking life, and that is really only in decreed punishments by Allah, where they meet the mandatory level of evidence. And there are other verses in the Quran where Allah says in Surah Al-Isra, the 17th chapter, in verse number 33, in the meaning, don't kill the soul which Allah has forbidden except by right. And whoever's killed unjustly, we've given his heir authority, but let him not exceed the limits in the matter of taking a life. So the matter of life and death is determined by what Allah has said. And the other side of it is Allah and his messenger gave us an understanding about human suffering. We don't believe that life is what happens between birth and death. We believe there's life after death, that death is a transition from one part of our existence to another. And what determines the afterlife is how we live in the current life. And the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, it's narrated in one hadith in Bukhari that he said in the meaning, amongst nations before you, there's a man who got a wound, growing impatient with its pain, and he took a knife and he cut his hand with it, and the blood didn't stop till he died. Assisted suicide, really, isn't it? And Allah said in this hadith, the Prophet says, Allah said, my slave hurried to bring death upon himself, so I've forbidden him to enter paradise. So I mean, and it's interesting, this hadith is talking about effectively somebody taking their own life through illness, through suffering, through illness. So there couldn't be a more pertinent hadith. And we know that suffering in this world is something that brings elevation in the afterlife. So no fatigue, no disease, no sorrow, no sadness, no hurt, no distress befalls a Muslim, even if it were the prick from a thorn, except that Allah expiates some of his sins for that. So what do we say when we meet someone who's ill? We say, tahuran, we say, may you be purified by this illness. May Allah be pure. May Allah make this illness a purification for you.
Thank you. But isn't there a prayer as well where you can address Allah, asking, if death is what you wish for me, may it happen, or do you wish me to stay? There's almost an invitation there, not to kill oneself, of course.
Absolutely.
But nevertheless to petition God in this regard. Do you want me to stay here and endure, or take me to? It's a beautiful prayer. Could you remind us about that?
Well, I don't have the prayer in front of me, but you're right. But it is, if Allah, if life is good for me, then give it to me, and if death is good for me, then you give it to me. We shouldn't fear death in the way that people often do fear death. Rather, if you fear something, you fear your account before Allah after death. Yes. Death is the point at which your deeds effectively stop. So your chance to do good, your chance to please Allah, it ends there. Yeah. But I think one thing that's often missed here is we aren't individuals who live as islands. We live in communities. So if you've ever seen anyone suffer or be ill or been around them when they're dying, what do you see around them except their loved ones?
Mm-hmm.
And their loved ones don't want them to die quickly.
Mm-hmm.
Their loved ones want them to live longer. And their loved ones earn the pleasure of Allah and bring more love within the family and community by caring for the person who's sick and dying.
Yeah.
And so a single person's death is not just an experience for themselves. A single person's death is also an experience for the whole community, their family and the whole community. And the community has succeeded if it does what it could to help that dying sick person. And a community has failed if they leave that person to die and suffer on their own. And so our human experience is as communities, it's not as individuals. One of the fears that has been raised about this bill is I heard one lawyer say, I shouldn't laugh at this, but it's terrible. I heard one lawyer say that he said, do you know how much the probate courts in this country, this is the courts that deal with inheritance, do you know how much they are bogged down with families disputing over inheritance? Now, if you then throw the assisted suicide thing into the equation, and imagine you've got a person who's dying and they have several children, and they ask one of them to facilitate all of this stuff, and they get the two doctors and the judge to sign it off, and then they take the pills, and then all of them find out afterwards that this has happened. Are you telling me that there are not going to be families where there isn't going to be disputes between the remaining families over the fact that, did this person act in a way which was in their own interests or in the interest of our parent? You can really see the scope for a lot of division, a lot of nastiness, where you throw this strange new thing into the equation, which is suddenly we're facilitating death as opposed to preserving life. And you can really see these issues are going to come in practical ways which people will not see. And this takes me to my second point, which is the issue of legislation itself. Paul, do you remember in 2004 in the UK, the MPs in this country voted to ban fox hunting?
Yes.
How long do you think they spent in Parliament debating whether or not hunting should be abolished? How many hours of parliamentary time do you think they debated the pros and cons of this?
Gosh, I would have thought quite a bit, actually. A lot of Conservative MPs would be in favour of hunting down poor animals until they're dead. And the opposition.
How long do you think? How long?
Oh gosh, I don't know. How long's a piece of string? Days? Was it weeks? I don't know. Was it?
Okay, so well, I don't know. I wouldn't have known this if I hadn't seen the figures. But if you had to guess how many hours, let's say days, how many days would we put it? 4 days, 5 days for one piece of legislation? Would you say?
Yeah. I mean,
so that would be 4 or 5 days would be about 100, 120 hours, something like that.
Yeah, I know where you're going with this. I do remember that about when there was it the Countryside Alliance? The white middle class in Britain suddenly became very mobilised, and there were huge demonstrations in London and elsewhere in favour of the right to kill foxes, because hey, this is such an important thing to do. So I would imagine, therefore, that there was an ongoing struggle in the public square about this issue. Therefore, I deduce that I may have thought a couple of days might have been more than enough to debate it, but it went on and on and on. That would be.
It was apparently it was about 700 hours of parliamentary time.
Ooh.
All right.
That's many.
This bill, which is about human life, has just had 5 hours of parliamentary time so far. Okay. Now, one thing I raised in my article was when you start thinking of the complexities, the ethical complexities, the practical problems, the issues of rights, trying to outweigh the issue of one individual having the right to take their own life over a vulnerable person who might be coerced into it. What makes us think that we even have the right, how arrogant are we to think that we even have the right to delve into such matters to make laws? And for me, this issue is possibly one of the clearest ones of the dangers we find ourselves when we replace fixed legislative principles in revelation with human efforts to second guess that revelation. And it really, the more I think about this issue, the more I can see problems with it. And the more I can see the dilemmas you would have of trying to figure out the unforeseen consequences, which by definition you're not going to, because they're unforeseen.
Well, you say that, but actually we do have precedents in Canada, in the Netherlands and elsewhere.
Yes,
where in fact we can actually deduce what may well happen. These are very similar social, economic, political context to ours. So, we can perhaps predict what may well happen. Indeed, you've done precisely that. And it is a very dark scenario that may well unfold. And even in the UK, we've seen with abortion and other things where initially there were great promises to this exceptional, restrictive context, but ultimately it kind of unraveled quite a bit. And we're seeing that being pushed against even today, people wanting greater access to abortion without any doctor's involvement. So this is not going to stop here, is it? There's always going to be pressure to liberalize and make it more easy to access abortions or suicides or whatever.
Yes, and like I said, even what we know from the Canada experience or Oregon experience, these are very early days to understand the nature of these changes in society. So back in the 60s, a lot of laws were changed, which made sexual relations more liberal, and all of these facilitated to change society in a way that people don't feel the necessity to get married, don't feel the necessity to have commitment as much, don't feel the necessity to have children so much. Now, who in the 1960s would have thought that in the 2020s, where whole Western societies will be questioning whether or not their populations are sustainable anymore because the birth rates have fallen so low?
I think there is an answer to that. I mean, generally you're right, but I think to credit where it's due, in the Catholic Church, there's a document called Humanae Vitae, this was issued just after the Second Vatican Council in the 1960s. Hugely unpopular within the church because it maintained it confirmed the continued prohibition on artificial contraception, and it was just assumed that the contraceptive rule would be abandoned or abrogated in the modern world. Vatican II was all about opening up the windows into the modern world, being more modernizing the church, really. So no one thought that the church would reassert its teaching on artificial contraception. But I'm not concerned with the artificial contraception bit. But if you read Humanae Vitae, it predicts what will happen in the future. And it was very prophetic. And it spoke about the breakdown of family, casual relationships, cohabitation, all of these things in ways which are remarkably prophetic about what actually happened. And Pope Francis has noted this. And this is why it's still part of church teaching, because it seems to have turned out to be true. The loosening of morals, sexual morals, and so on, has had a very negative impact on our societies. And Humanae Vitae got it right prophetically in the 1960s, right at the beginning of this process. Now, I think most legislators and social commentators didn't see it. You're right. But there was a lone voice, which is still acknowledged even today by even non-Catholics, as actually having foreseen the consequences of this liberalization in sexuality and relationships and procreation, and the emphasis on hedonism, the effect it would have on women. It was all there in Humanae Vitae I forget the exact date, but in 1960s when this was written by Pope.
There in Islam, we believe that under an Islamic system, there will be consultation amongst people, where governments will consult with elected assemblies to decide on some things like traffic rules or priorities in certain areas of society. But these are very different to the very fundamental questions that Western societies decide they will debate on the basis of, and I truly think when I was seeing some of the commentators, the media commentators comment on this, and they were saying, wow, this is a really momentous day, I think they were also a bit shell-shocked, because they were hearing both sides of the argument. And I genuinely think many of them didn't know how they would make up their mind. How do you decide whether somebody has the right to choose their own death? And how do you protect the vulnerable from being coerced? Because there's really no way. We've all heard elderly people saying, I don't want to be a burden on my family. Now, how, when you allow this assisted suicide, how do you prevent that elderly person from being made to feel that they should choose that route? If there isn't an absolute red line that no, that's not an option for anyone, as soon as you open that opportunity, then you will change practice. And one of the things I've seen in the last 25 years probably in Western societies is things that were said to be absolute prohibitions. We're never going to allow them.
Yes.
When society likes, it changes them. So torture, torture is something that, according to the Western legal tradition, under international law, if you commit torture in Egypt, you can be prosecuted in London. Okay, it is absolutely that. Right. But they opened the doors to torture in the war on terror. They used torture in Bagram Air Base in Afghanistan. They used torture in Guantanamo Bay,
in Europe,
black sites around the world. So they're happy to change the rules when it suits their needs, when they can find a benefit for it. And this is the same kind of argument, but on an individual level. Happy to justify genocide at the moment, in Gaza, under the same principles.
Perhaps it's a completely different topic, but and this is something I've seen in the last 24 hours. Legislators in the United States, senators, congressmen, Democrats from the Democratic Party, a year ago, repeatedly stated in public that the President of the United States, Joe Biden, would not issue a pardon for his son, Hunter, this guy Hunter. They said, what? But the reason is why? Because the Democrats, unlike the Republicans, believe in the rule of law. You cannot break the rule of law. We uphold the rule of law. And repeatedly, senators said, these are legislators, like MPs in Parliament. We will not back down on this. We uphold the law endlessly. And then, of course, we see, within the last 36 hours, the president himself pardoning his son. Even the president himself has said, I uphold the rule of law. But that's what marks our civilization. That's what marks us as Americans. We don't put personal interests above the law. He is pompously saying that. They're all saying it. And what happens? They completely betray their own commitments, their own principles, are thrown under the bus. And I mentioned this bizarre, true story, because legislators in England may say, well, safeguards. Can we really even trust them? Because at the end of the day, in certain different, they may feel ultimately, well, actually, this old lady doesn't want to be a burden. Perhaps we should let her, but let her kill herself. I don't really trust the politicians who have no divine law that they are submitted to, that they reference. They will change their minds if they want to, because they don't feel any allegiance or responsibility to their creator. That's why I personally trust them.
And this, for your students in your classes that you teach in your Blogging Theology Academy, will be very familiar with the principle of utilitarian principles, the greatest good for the greatest number, right? So one of the arguments behind this bill for people in favor of it is, well, if 80% of the population will benefit from that choice, then we shouldn't stop it just because 20% might be harmed by it. Now, imagine you take that argument further in the future and you argue, well, social care costs for elderly people or vulnerable people are going up and up and up. And if we convince more people that when they've reached the pinnacle of their life and it's all downhill from there, if we convince more people to take the assisted suicide route, it'll be cheaper for all of us in the long run, or most of us in the long run. So you can see where crossing this particular barrier is potentially taking them. And I know the defenders of this bill will say this is exaggeration. You're taking one issue, which is very narrow, about the terminally ill people, and just in the last 6 months of life. I'm sorry, you can't convince me of that, because I have about 50 years of social change in Western civilization that really goes against that.
Yes.
And you're just burying your head in the sand when you're not admitting that. And that is really where we're coming from a rational perspective. And thank God, thank Allah for the fact that we have some pillars which we have as Muslims for humanity to like keep some civilizational lines which we don't cross and we can't cross, and we must never ever cross.
And also I find it a huge relief, emotionally, psychologically relief. I don't have to work out my views on these incredibly difficult issues. I can simply refer, and I do. I simply, well, what has God said in his word? And I look it up, and it says, don't kill yourselves. And I look at, you quoted this incredible hadith, the Prophet upon him be peace, where the guy who had a wound and then he cut his hand and bled to death. This is very clear. I've got my guidance. We've all got our guidance. We don't need to discuss this. Thank you very much. Let's get on with our lives and in a way that's pleasing to God. It's a huge relief not having to sort all this out myself. And on a whole range of issues, it's like that. I don't have to worry about this issue or that. God has spoken. End of story. He is our creator, our designer. We are accountable to him. That's all that matters, really. And he is our Rahman Rahim, the most merciful, compassionate, and the wise. He's the most wise. He knows what's best for us. Who am I to second guess our creator, to have an opinion that is contrary to his wisdom? I mean, it's the most outrageous hubris. So I'm relieved that we follow a God who's given us this guidance to give us walk on the straight path. We don't need to invent the wheel every 5 minutes with all these dilemmas and trying to work out what we need to do.
Absolutely. And I think that these are strengths for us. But I have to be honest, I found the change last week deeply depressing. And when I say this is like assisting the death of Western civilization, I absolutely think it is. You are taking a step which you are justifying things that you never could have countenance justifying in the past.
Yeah,
really, this is literally, you would never have gone down this road of countenancing assisted suicide. Why? Because you held the principle of upholding human life, and we've seen it too much. We've seen, well, I say it's the torture, whether it's the genocide, whether it's we've seen this happen so many times in the past, and it's a slow death of some civilizational principles in this society, which honestly, it doesn't make me happy at all. Except that I hope more and more people who realize the problem of them will look to an alternative in the future, to be honest.
Yes. And you mentioned your article, The Assisted Death of Western Civilization. I think it's a very clever, brilliant title, actually, published on the 5 Pillars website, 5pillarsuk.com, published on the 1st of December. I'll link to it in the description below. It's a really worth reading, I think, if you wanted to reflect on these matters further. So I think we might leave it there. There's so much we could talk about further, but I think we've covered some of the most fundamental issues here, philosophical as well as medical and palliative and so on. Do you have any last words before we?
No, I would say watch this space, and I hope people here see sense about it. But you know what? If it doesn't go through, unless there's some fundamental changes in the philosophy that underpins this civilization, I think we will see this go through one day.
Yes, I think you're right. That's where we're at as a civilization. We're at that level of terminal decline, that this is going to happen unless something incredible happens. But thank you very much, Abdul Wahid, for your time as a medical doctor, as a Muslim, as a commentator. Your insights are always extremely valuable, to be honest, and I've really welcomed them. And long may you continue your work as well. So thank you. Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.